Hey y'all, welcome back again to another episode of Healthy Design. Not sure if Stormie's going to accompany me today during my discussion on insulin resistance and how to reverse it. We're going to talk about diet and its impact on insulin resistance today. So that's kind of the plan. Uh, Most people, when they hear diet, they think they're trying to lose weight. So really, whenever I say diet, unless I specify, I just mean eating plan. Because I follow a diet to gain weight, I follow a diet to lose weight, but the diet itself is just the eating plan. And then whatever I'm trying to accomplish is either the fat loss part of the muscle gain side. So basically, when it comes to losing weight, there's a little more to it, but all in all, calories in versus calories out is the biggest thing that determines whether you lose weight or not. And you can follow some of the old videos I've done regarding my fat loss phase, diet in general, and different things. We've talked about this multiple times that we don't want to just lose weight. Just losing weight, we could actually lose weight and be more unhealthy afterwards. What we want to lose is we want to lose body fat. If we lose body fat, we can definitely be in a much healthier place afterwards rather than in a worse place from a health standpoint afterwards. So that's why we want to try to focus on fat loss. And so we need to really change how we think about things and not say that it's this weight loss journey or we're trying to lose weight. It's a fat loss journey. We're trying to lose fat. We're not just trying to lose weight. We could actually lose more muscle, lose, bone density, lose all these other things and either keep body fat the same or even higher. But if we lost more of that, we still lost weight, so it looked successful on the scale, but definitely would be a negative as far as our health goes. This coincides with insulin resistance too. If you're losing weight and you're losing muscle at the same time, or the vast majority of that weight is muscle, then you're losing one of your best places to store glucose and use the insulin, use the glucose that's in your bloodstream. And so that's going to end up leading to more problems on things. So again, we've seen this with other things we talked about. When you lose muscle, you have increased insulin resistance because you don't have the same storage capacity. And so it's real easy to stop this loss of muscle mass. You just need to exercise. If we will lift weights, then we are sending a signal to our body that we need to maintain that muscle mass. We don't need to lose it. And, you don't even have to work out anywhere close to perfect or optimal to get that signal across. Going in, working out, even stopping several reps short of failure will be enough to elicit that signal and keep the muscle that you have. And if you've never exercised before, you'll probably even build muscle too. And so this is one of the great things for someone, let's say they are a little bit overweight, metabolic syndrome going on, they haven't exercised before. If they will just start to exercise some, we may not see huge changes on the scale, like their body weight may stay the same, but we very well may see big changes in the way they look. Part of this is because body recomposition is a thing. The newer you are to training, so the less training you've done, the more body fat you have, different things like that, you will see more of this recomposition effect versus someone who's been exercising for years, is already very lean, etc. So what this recomposition is that you truly are replacing some of the fat that you had with muscle. So you're building muscle and losing fat at the same time. I mean, that's like the holy grail. That's what every bodybuilder would love to have. Unfortunately, it just doesn't work well as you progress and you've got more muscle and less body fat, and there's not as much of that recomposition that can occur. But if you've never worked out before, a lot of that can occur. So yeah, the scale weight may not be changing a whole lot, but your body fat percentage may be changing drastically. I mean, if you lose 5 pounds of fat and gain 5 pounds of muscle, that's a 10-pound shift. So, try to think about things that way. So that can be pretty miraculous if you've never worked out before. And again, don't get too caught up on the scale weight. It can come in handy to help guide you on your path, whether you're trying to gain muscle, lose body fat, or just trying to be healthy, but it's definitely not the end all be all. And again, watch some of the fat loss journey videos. They'll talk a whole lot more about this in a lot more depth as well. If I talked about that in depth now, this will probably be like a 2-3 hour podcast. I don't think anybody wants that, so I'll try to keep it shorter. Um, so the other thing that we've seen, and I've talked about this in some of those videos too, is that a lot of times when people decide they want to lose weight, again, should want to lose body fat, not lose weight, is that they're going to do everything all at once. So they're going to drop their calories excessively, start exercising a lot, do all this kind of stuff. Well, we don't really want this excess calorie restriction, because that in and of itself can lead to increased insulin resistance. We're trying to make our bodies more sensitive to insulin, not resistant to it. So a huge calorie restriction is going to make us more insulin resistant. Part of this has to do with cortisol. Basically, that extreme drop in calories is another stress our body has to deal with. So to deal with stress, cortisol is increased. And so cortisol itself can make muscle and it can make other organs insulin resistant. And so that's a negative for us, not a positive for us. Now, if we continue this long enough too, thyroid hormone levels drop, and then that's going to make us more insulin resistant as well, or more insulin resistant as well. And we talked about this in one of the other videos too, about just how excessive dieting can lead to some of these changes. So there's a lot of good information in these past videos you guys might want to go and see that relate to health, but are relating specifically to insulin resistance in this case. That's why more often we want to do that kind of low and slow approach to fat loss. A mild calorie restriction does not have these same changes in cortisol, same changes in thyroid hormones, and actually it's been shown to make us more insulin sensitive. So now, part of my fat loss diet or phase, I did do a rapid fat loss protocol, which is a pretty severe cut in calories, but it was only for a few days each week, and then I'd increase calories on the weekend, etc. So you can get some information on how I did, how I kind of structure things for me with that. Not saying that's the best way to structure things for you, but it gives you an idea on stuff. You can't keep doing that severe calorie restriction for long periods of time without getting into problems. We talked before about starvation leading to insulin resistance. That's basically what it is. If you cut calories enough, you're starving yourself. And then if you cut them enough, you're going to end up burning a lot of muscle to try to meet the needs that your body has. Again, we're losing that storage place for glucose, and then that's going to make us more insulin resistant too. So I think you're starting to see how a lot of these things tie in together, and how it's kind of this cycle that can feed on itself and then kind of keep getting bigger and bigger. All right. I have to admit, this is one of my kind of pet peeves with diet. You hear people talk all the time about fiber and how fiber is wonderful and everybody has to have fiber. I'm just not so sure that's the case. I think fiber is great for some people, and I think it's terrible for others. So I think there's a much more nuanced approach to it, rather than just increase your fiber intake and it's going to be wonderful for everyone. I just don't think that's the case. Some people, whether it's their gut health, the gut bacteria they have, whether it's other issues, they don't seem to do well with fiber. Other people do very well with it. So this is where you need to test a little bit, excuse me, and see what works best for you. Part of the confusion with a lot of this is you have a lot of epidemiology studies that will say, oh, increased fiber content is improved health outcomes and improved this, improved that. Well, epidemiology studies, they're not very good. Basically, it's questionnaires. You call people or you talk to people and you ask them what they ate, and they're just telling you what they remember. Maybe it's not even what they remember. Maybe they're just saying what they think you want to hear. Who knows? There's just a whole lot of issues with that. Rather than like a clinical trial or something where you know what people are eating and you're controlling that, then you know what impact it has. So unfortunately, a lot of the nutritional studies are more of those epidemiological studies, and I think that's why we see all these conflicting reports all the time. Like 1 week eggs are good for you, the next week eggs are bad for you, and it just keeps going on and on. So some of that's the studies that are being done, and epidemiology is like the lowest form, by giving us good value for the study, because again, it's just going to find maybe a correlation with things, but correlation does not equal causation. If that correlation is high enough, then that could point to there being a causation, and other studies needing to be done to determine that. But if the correlation is very low, it's probably just noise. And so it's not even worth looking into, it's not even worth stating, not even worth studying. But anyway, the other problem with a lot of those studies, guar gum is used as the fiber. Most of us are not using guar gum as the fiber that we're getting in our diet. We're getting it from foods, so vegetables, fruits, or we're using some sort of supplement that again is not guar gum. So we can't definitely make connections between, okay, we increase our fiber amount to this, it's going to have this impact based on the study, because the fiber they're using is not one we're normally using. So that makes it a little bit trickier as well. But they did have a study that used 50 grams per day of fiber from real foods, so fruits, vegetables, grains, different things like that. And it did improve insulin sensitivity, so increased insulin sensitivity, good thing. And it did so in 6 weeks. The other thing they found with some of these studies that soluble fiber versus insoluble fiber tends to be better regarding insulin resistance and decreasing it or improving insulin resistance. Soluble fiber is the fiber that you find in your fruits and vegetables. Insoluble fiber is more what you find in grains and different things like that. So the other part of this is they haven't kind of tease these studies out enough and kind of combine some different things. Some have looked at like, kind of higher carb, higher, fiber intake, so like a lower carb, low fiber intake, higher carb, high fiber intake, or different things like that. But they haven't necessarily looked at high fiber and high fat. A lot of times whenever they do increase the fiber, they're decreasing the fat too. Some studies suggest that increasing the fat content along with the fiber content can increase the satiety of the meal. So you're more satiated, you're more full afterwards. That could have impacts on fat loss and things too, because if you're more full, you won't be as likely to eat. And so you could technically be full on fewer calories, and then that equals our calories in, calories out, and can lead to fat loss. There have been some studies that seem to show that increasing the fiber and the fat tends to have a bigger impact on insulin resistance, i.e. decreasing insulin resistance, increasing insulin sensitivity. But we need more studies to really know that for sure. And this may be something we find that is more individual. So doing some testing on yourself, you may figure out what works for you better than waiting on the studies to try to tell you. All right, so another thing, let's see, this was popular. I first heard about intermittent fasting, it's been probably about 20 years ago, 15, 20 at least. And then it seemed like a few years after that, that's when it got more popular, mainstream, and still pretty popular today. And so there are some good things about intermittent fasting. As far as fat loss goes, the main thing with it is it restricts the time that you can eat. So therefore it restricts the calories that you eat. So again, calories in versus calories out. However, there may be some benefits to intermittent fasting when it comes to insulin sensitivity. The other thing to be aware of, people will mention intermittent fasting and they kind of mention it like it's this one thing. Intermittent fasting is all kinds of things. You could have intermittent fasting on a daily basis where you have the fasting period each day, which technically everybody does. While you're asleep, you're fasting. So everybody has 6 hours fasting, if not more. 6 to 10 hours of fasting just with sleep, and then they start eating. So technically that's intermittent fasting, what people do every day on a normal daily basis without thinking about anything. It can go up to where people eat normal one day and fast one day. So it could be this alternate day fast. So there's all kinds of permutations, so everything in between the two. What they have found is that doing that intermittent fasting daily or doing that every other day fast, that can improve insulin sensitivity. They think this is due to the increased glucagon that kind of goes against insulin. And so that way it helps to kind of burn some of the things and kind of burn things off rather than insulin kind of keeps us from burning fat. The problem with fasting, there's a study that people love to do, and Dr. Jason Fung, he'll mention this a lot too, and I think it's viable, and I think it's valuable as well. So don't get me wrong on this, but there was a man who studied. Hold on, I think Stormie might want to come up. Oh, nope, she ran away. Um, he fasted for like 382 days, I believe it was. It was well over 300, and closer to 400 than even 350. Now, he did this under medical supervision, and so that's one thing we want to be careful with too. If you are fasting, we still need to make sure you're getting proper hydration in, still need to make sure you're getting all the minerals that you need each day. So there's a way you can do that. There's a way to do it safely. There's a way to do it where it's not so safe. Um, the other risk factor is breaking that fast. You can't just eat whatever afterwards, or there's possible negatives that could occur. And so definitely after you've done fasting, whether it's for a day, multiple days, whatever, not a good idea to eat a lot of processed carbohydrates and things. That's not going to work well for you. Our circadian rhythm plays a role on things too. And so part of this is we have different hormones that have these patterns during the day. Insulin's no stranger to this too. And so we're actually more insulin resistant in the morning than we are later on in the day and in the evening. A lot of times it seems like this is kind of like around 5:30 where that insulin level is higher, even though we haven't eaten. And then it kind of stays elevated for about 2 hours and then starts dropping back down. And so again, tend to be mildly insulin resistant in the morning. Not saying it's this huge insulin resistance because that insulin's up so high, but it is a little bit higher. And so the funny thing too, you'll hear people talk a lot of times about trying to eat carbohydrates in the morning rather than later in the day. And I don't personally think that's the best idea. I mean, so I don't think that's the best idea for everyone. I think it probably will be the best idea for some people, but I think for the majority of people, if they would shift their carbohydrates to later in the day, that's what they're going to see bigger benefits with. And that's what I've seen in my practice as well. That people tend to do better having their carbs at the end of the day. If they eat them earlier in the day, they tend to have more lethargy, they tend to have more issues, their health doesn't seem to be as good. Whereas if they push them to later in the day, their energy levels are better, they can think more clearly, their health improves. Again, I'm not saying that's the way it's going to work for everyone, but that's what I see. So that is what I'm biased towards. Again, not saying it can't work having them early in the morning. I just think most people it's going to work better later in the day. So if you haven't tried that, give that a shot. If it doesn't work for you, try something else. Because again, I'm not saying there's just one size fits all for everyone, because there is not a one size fits all for everyone. If there was, this would be really simple and really easy, and I could just tell everybody to do the exact same thing and they'd all get the exact same wonderful results. But that doesn't happen. That would make my life and my job a whole lot easier, but it just doesn't exist. So again, that's why I think we want to do that. So for me personally, that's what I do. I eat carbohydrates later in the day if I'm going to have them normally. I'm not as big of a stickler on this as I was before. There's probably a time where I was a little more adamant about that. Like you had to eat carbs later in the day, and if it was light outside, you don't eat carbs. Just kind of saying that as a little bit sarcastic, but not too much. And so I'm not as particular about that now. One thing I have always noticed for me, so again, this may be helpful for other people as well. If I did have like a big breakfast where there was a lot of carbohydrates in there, I would be lethargic afterwards. But if I'll make sure I increase the protein intake during that meal, then I don't have that same lethargy and fatigue afterwards and just want to go to sleep. So, kind of that carb coma, it gets to be decreased if I make sure I have a lot of protein in the meal, kind of counteracts the carbohydrates. So something to keep in mind. So I do prefer to keep carbohydrates in the evening. I also prefer to keep carbohydrates around exercise rather than in the morning for breakfast. Again, I will eat them on Saturdays, but that is also normally after climbing or working out too. So there is some insulin sensitizing benefits from the exercise prior to having those foods. And again, we know with exercise, we don't even need insulin to help get that sugar into the muscle on different things. So that's something we talked about last time. All right, so let's move on. Carb restriction. This is my bias based on the people that I see. Again, I'm seeing people that have different issues with health. So if you are perfectly healthy, have no health issues whatsoever, maybe you don't need to restrict any carbohydrates. I think Stormy might be coming. She's just sniffing me out. Sorry to keep kind of looking down, but um, she likes to make an appearance every now and then. So again, if you're perfectly healthy, maybe this does not apply to you as much, but if you have any kind of health issue, I think this is worth looking into. Again, it may not be the answer for you, but I'm willing to bet you'll notice some benefits and then you'll have to play with things. There's a book, Eat Rich, Live Long. Dr. Gerber and Ivor Cummings, I believe, were the authors. And I mean, they have ways in there to figure out kind of how much carbohydrates. So they have like a really low group, more of a medium, and a little bit higher group. So it's something like that where, again, you can kind of tailor it to see how you're responding. Makes a lot more sense to me rather than saying like this one blanket thing like, oh, no one should have more than just throwing out a number, 30 grams of carbs a day. Yeah, again, that's on the really low side. I'm not saying that's the case, but I think even saying that period, it's not going to work. It'll work great for some people, not for others. There's going to be a range, and people are going to fall somewhere in that range. Um, so one of the things too, if you do restrict your carbohydrates, you have to increase your fat intake. This is where I see a lot of people go wrong when they switch to a lower carbohydrate diet. What they do is they also don't increase their fat intake. And so now they have no energy source coming in. Stormy did come up onto my lap. So there she is. She's probably going to go after the microphone now. So if you're eating low fat and low carbohydrate, then you pretty much have no fuel source coming in from your diet and you're going to feel like crap. And that's what people report. So it's not a surprise. So if you do decide to restrict carbohydrates, please make sure that you're increasing your fat content. This might have been a mistake, but she jumped up on a bench and got into my lap. So we'll see how long this lasts. So the good thing is if you increase that fat intake and lower the carbohydrates, fat doesn't have much of an impact on insulin levels. Protein, it does have some impact on insulin levels. Some think that it's more the leucine than one of the amino acids that has the biggest impact. But it can maybe make insulin level rise, 2 times. However, carbohydrates and sugar, that can make insulin level rise 10 times. So again, we can see where restricting the carbohydrates might have a bigger impact on insulin resistance. And it should be interesting to note too that the first documented intervention for diabetes and for weight loss was carb restriction. And this was in the early to mid 1800s. However, that standard for intervention changed in the early to mid 1900s. And then, they shifted from their focus of eating meat, eggs, cheese, and avoiding breads, pasta, sugar to the opposite, kind of lowering the meat, eggs, and cheese and eating more of the other stuff. And then what we've seen is more insulin resistance as a result. The other thing Dr. Bickman talks about in this book is the glycemic load in insulin. I personally don't care about glycemic load and the glycemic index. I think it's all just making things more complicated than it needs to be and trying to figure out a way to eat things or have things and figure out the impact that it has. I think it's more complication than what you really need to do. If you really want to figure that stuff out, I think the best way to do that is get a continuous glucose monitor and see what happens to your blood sugar levels after you eat certain things. That's going to give you a lot more information than just the glycemic index or the glycemic load. Now, it takes a lot more effort and you have to be diligent about tracking things for a while to figure that out. But we know with certain studies that, things that you would expect to increase insulin and increase blood sugar, like a cookie, it will do so for some people. And then for others, it'll have no impact at all. And then other things that you wouldn't expect to increase glucose, it won't for people. And then it will for others. And they tend to be the ones that could eat the cookie and not have an issue, but yet they eat that and they do. So everybody's different. There's a little difference there. I think it's better just test that on yourself rather than relying on glycemic index or glycemic load. Another interesting aside on this, the gut bacteria you have, might actually determine how you're responding to these foods. So again, gut health could play a big role in that, and having diverse bacteria. But again, we don't know exactly what a diverse bacteria for optimal health is. It seems to depend on where you live and what you grew up with, different things like that. So I think that's another kind of rabbit hole you can go down and get all kinds of information, but it might not actually be that helpful or that applicable. So moving on to fats. People get concerned if they increase fats. If I increase saturated fat, it's going to be more cholesterol, clog up my arteries, all this kind of stuff. That's not what we see. We've talked about cholesterol before, so again, I recommend going to watch those videos. I won't get into it here, but I've covered it in I think 3, and you can listen to other people too. Again, the one thing that should be interesting for people is that the cholesterol values used to be high only if they were over 300. But then with the development of statins and other drugs, then that number keeps getting lowered. It was 250, now it's 200, and they want to lower it even more. Now, is that really because cholesterol is an issue, or is that because they want to sell more drugs? I'll leave you to figure that out. I have my thoughts, but I'll let you have your own. So it should be noted, though, that if we increase saturated fat intake in our diet, for the vast majority of people, we actually end up seeing less saturated fat in their blood. So it's not that we increase the saturated fat intake, we see increased levels of saturated fat in the blood. We see the opposite. We talked again about good fat, bad fat in the muscles and other organs, triglycerides being kind of the good fat and ceramides being the bad fat. Again, if we increase saturated fat intake, we don't tend to see the increased ceramides. We tend to see that more so with increased carbohydrate intake. So just something else to keep in mind. And then another topic we talked about before is oxidative stress and inflammation. When studies have been done and people are eating a lower carbohydrate, higher fat diet, we tend to see decreased oxidative stress and we tend to see decreased inflammation. This could be due to ketones. Ketones do have an antioxidant effect, and they also have an anti-inflammatory effect. So maybe that's where these impacts and these differences are coming from. And so that brings us on to a ketogenic diet. So if you fast for 18 to 24 hours or more, or carb restriction is low enough that it can cause the body to shift to producing ketones, and they're going to be used for fuel versus the carbohydrates that you would normally have eaten or taken in. And so this is ketogenesis. And so this can be a good thing. Again, we know for certain seizure disorders that are not responsive to drugs, not responsive to other forms of treatment, a ketogenic diet can stop those seizures, period. Not saying that's always the case, but for the ones that seem to be intractable, ketogenic diet's the way to go. Now, I'm not sure that eating a ketogenic diet is the healthiest thing for healthy people to do long term. If you have seizures, I think it's definitely the way to go because we know the seizures can create other issues and other damage, and we want to avoid that. And so having a ketogenic diet is the way to go there if it's, again, those seizures aren't responsive to medications and other things. So with this ketogenesis, what happens is the liver will turn some of the fat that it has into ketones, and they're to be used for fuel. Our heart can use ketones for fuel. Our brain can use ketones for fuel. Basically, most cells can use ketones for fuel. You can see Stormie's got her paws pulling. She's a little out of the picture, but still going after the microphone, so gotta love the kitten. So the good thing about ketones, though, they actually can increase the number of mitochondria we have. Again, if you followed me at all, you know that I'm a big believer in the mitochondria, and I think they're the key to our health. And so we want the right kind of numbers and density, and it's not just one or the other. We need kind of both. Hopefully that's not messing up the sound her playing. The ketones, again, decrease oxidative stress. They decrease inflammation. And so the other thing, they can promote healthy beta cell function. And the beta cells of our pancreas are the ones that produce insulin in the first place. So the thing with high carbohydrate diets or high insulin, if you have a high carbohydrate diet, you're probably going to have more insulin going, and then that high insulin level, it stops ketogenesis. So it prevents that from occurring in the first place. All right, weight control. There are plenty of studies that have shown you can lose weight on a higher carb diet or a lower carb diet. And I'm not going to say there's anything wrong with those studies. I think that's accurate. If you do everything, you can lose weight, you can lose body fat via both. For the majority of people that I've worked with, I would say the lower carbohydrate diet is easier for them to lose body fat with because there's increased fullness. What I see most often with a higher carb diet and trying to lose weight, you're just hungry all the time and it's hard. You have cravings and it's hard not to just go binge. So that's not going to be the case for everybody, but that's what I see quite often. And so the other thing, oh, she got the microphone. All right, let me try this again. So one other thing that you'll hear oftentimes on the low carb side of people, that low carb group, they'll talk about how a lower carb diet increases metabolic rate. They are correct, but these effects are way overblown. And so that's why I don't say, oh, the only way to lose body fat is to have a lower carb diet. No, you can, as long as the calories in versus calories out, you've got that part managed, you can lose it with a high carb diet or a low carb diet. So the studies do show there is a slight increase in metabolic or in our metabolism with that lower carb. So again, they are accurate in what they're saying, but again, the effects are overblown. So depending on the study you look at, most often you'll see somewhere between like an 80 calorie to 300 calorie per day increase in metabolism. I think that 300 calorie is probably really overestimating things and pushing things. Some of it depends on how they're determining basal metabolic rate. And I mean, that's kind of hard to do in the first place. So again, I wouldn't look at these studies as being ideal and using that as your reason for doing things. Again, I use a lower carbohydrate diet most days when I'm trying to lose body fat because I know that works well for me. But then I do have some days where I have higher carbohydrate intake. So it's not just all low. But again, let's look at these numbers. We can do the math. 3,500 calories is about the calories it takes to store a pound of fat or to burn a pound of fat. Again, real world, things don't always work out that way, but the math gives us an estimate and it's close enough. So if we have 80 to a max of 300 calories per day, that means it's going to take 11.6 days for that 300 calorie increase to burn 1 pound of fat, or 43.75 days to burn 1 extra pound of body fat versus the other one. So you can see why I say this does not have much of an impact at all, because we're looking at at least a week and a half, if not almost 6 weeks. So you're not going to notice that 0.2% or 0.2 pounds loss. It's just not something you're going to pick up on. All right, so we're starting to get close to the end, which is pretty good because this has been a long video. So some of the other benefits you can get from lowering the carbohydrate intake and increasing the insulin sensitivity side. This is kind of one of those, where, kill 2 birds with 1 stone. You can kill multiple birds with 1 stone in this case. This makes sense. If you go back and listen to the earlier videos, we see how insulin resistance is involved in all these other disease processes. So if you improve it, you'll tend to improve them as well. So it makes sense. It's not kind of something magical. So blood pressure, you tend to get the largest decrease in blood pressure when you have the high fat diet group versus a higher carb group. In PCOS, they had those ladies had a 25% decrease in testosterone when they went on a lower carb diet. Again, with PCOS, there's issues with insulin resistance, and then you tend to get some issues with testosterone too. Now, for men, increasing their fat intake tends to increase their testosterone levels. And again, we've talked about testosterone for both men and women and the impacts it can have on insulin resistance. On the neurological side of things, Stormie's back in my lap if you're wondering why I'm looking down. There she goes. Oh my gosh, she is in rare form today. Sorry, guys. So increased fat will tend to improve symptoms with mild cognitive impairment and Alzheimer's. May improve work performance as well. And so this could be due to the brain being insulin resistant. So then it takes more glucose and insulin, and it just kind of can't work well. Now, if we're having ketones come in, now the brain can work properly and it's not dependent on glucose and insulin. Parkinson's, again, you can see improvements in the symptoms with a high fat diet versus a higher carb diet. Migraines, you can see up to a 75% improvement in migraine frequency by going to a low carb, high fat diet. Another one, reflux. So GERD, gastroesophageal reflux disease. Most studies report a reduction of GERD within 1 day of switching to that lower carb, higher fat diet. And what Dr. Bickman mentions in his book is that you get bored of reading that in every single study that, this was seen within 1 day. So that shows kind of how powerful this is. And again, I think that's some of the inflammation side of things from carbohydrates with skin. And this is something I can attest to personally from people I've worked with. You see improvements in acne, acanthus nigricans, psoriasis. I will speak clearly at some point, I promise, guys. So psoriasis, eczema, I tend to see this clear up quickly with people. I do think part of that is working on gut health, but the other side of that, with most of my clients, I am using a lower carb diet to get them started with things. Again, when I'm working with someone, I like to start at an extreme. I think starting in the middle, you don't know where to go when you need to make a change. If you started at an extreme, you know where to go because there's only one way to go. If you're extreme, you can't be more extreme. You can only move in the opposite direction. If you're in the middle, you can move in either direction, and then you got to make a guess on which way to go. So again, that's why I tend to start most people on that lower carb side. Not everybody stays there by any means, but again, if they're coming to see me, they got different health issues going on based on all. I may have to delete that part. I will try to keep her out of my lap for the rest of this. So again, if you're coming to see me and you've got different health issues, based on all this information we've talked about with the role of insulin resistance in other diseases and how to reverse it and then the impact that can have on other disease processes, it makes sense to do a low carb diet and to start there. Now, again, based on how the person responds, we may not stay there, or maybe we do. It just depends on them. But it makes sense to start there and then to tailor things as they need. May find they need just a little bit increase in carbohydrates, or maybe they need a significant increase. Again, I'm not married to any one diet approach or any one treatment approach, but you got to have somewhere to start. That's why I like to start at an extreme. And in my case, I tend to start on the low side. So that covers this part today for insulin resistance and how to reverse it. And so, as you can see, diet plays a huge role. This was a very long video, so I hope you guys have been entertained partly as you've gone through this, and it's been something you've learned from as well. I appreciate you watching. Thank you so much. Please like, subscribe, do all that fun stuff. And next week we'll talk about some of the different drugs and surgeries that could also improve insulin resistance and make us more insulin sensitive. But until then, guys, I hope you have a great one, and I'll talk to you next time. Bye.